Let me just say, there we go. So I wanted to also thank the Concord Public Library Foundation for supporting this program and give you a little introduction about Jane Oneail. So Jane curates and delivers art appreciation programs to audiences throughout New England and beyond. She holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. She's a New Hampshire native, and she's worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. And she has founded, and you can find her at the organization called Culturally Curious. And again, thank you guys for everyone for coming to the John Singer Sargent program. And I will now turn it over to Jane. Thank you very much for doing this, Jane.
Thank you, Robin. It's my pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about John Singer Sargent. Let's face it, it's just wonderful to indulge in his imagery because he transports us to a different, well, obviously a different time, but also just a different state of being where everybody just looks so elegant and so refined. So I thought we would start off with the height of elegance. This beautiful image on the screen here right now is a depiction of the Windham Sisters. This is painted in 1899. John Singer Sargent's at the height of his powers, at the height of his talent, at the height of his career. And this was such a celebrated work when it was exhibited. People referred to these three sisters as being the three graces. Now I can zoom out for you just for a moment. It's a much bigger picture than just what I had on the screen before. This is a work that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it's so successful because it's not just an elegant depiction of these beautiful women luxuriating in these incredible gowns. And you really get such a sense for the texture of these gorgeous gowns that they're wearing, but it's also a way to kind of highlight their genealogy too. These pictures in the background, all of this dark shadowy space in the background takes up almost 2/3 of the picture, but it's there to highlight their familial connections, their pedigree, their genealogy. So it was a really triumphant sort of debut for these women, at least in terms of their debut on canvas. All right, so before we move any further, I just wanted to highlight for a moment what I feel like are my personal connections to John Singer Sargent to keep us sort of grounded today. Now, some of you might remember 1999, it was the summer of Sargent. There was a fantastic solo exhibition of his work at the Museum of Fine Arts. And that was really my first introduction to the artist, and it knocked my socks off. I was still in college at the time. I graduated shortly thereafter, and I got a job at the Boston Public Library Foundation, where I helped to raise money for the restoration of the Sargent murals there. And from there, I started giving tours at the Gardner Museum, where Sargent's work is very well represented and where he himself was painting in the galleries about 100 years earlier. So I've always had a deep appreciation for his work, and I feel like my life has been kind of chasing after his in some ways. It feels really fun to make these connections in time and space. So let's continue on. I wanted to make one more note about the Windham Sisters here and just how different this is. When we think about traditional family portraiture, I have an image by the artist Charles Willson Peale from about 100 years earlier, another American artist over here. And you can see in this family portrait, well, the family members look close to each other. They're touching each other. They're smiling at each other in many cases. There's a sense of real connection here. But I think what is so unusual about Sargent's depictions of family members, especially these Windham sisters that we see over here, is that you could almost divide up the canvas and make it a solo portrait. They don't look like they're fond of each other. They don't look like they're connected to each other in any other way, but visually here. It's a really sort of interesting and sort of a distant, emotionally distant way to convey someone, but they certainly look impressive. They look powerful in so many ways. All right, well, let's turn our attention to how we'll move through the material tonight. I was telling Robin earlier, I'm always trying to cut this program down, but there's just too much good stuff to take out. We're going to start off with an introduction to the artist, and then we'll look at ways that he kind of traveled around Europe and took on different styles, kind of experimented with them until he landed on his own. We'll look at how his personal connections landed him commissions with all the right people. And then we'll turn our attention to some of his major works because he certainly had ambitions beyond being a portrait painter. We'll wrap up with his watercolors and then turn our attention to his death and his legacy. I didn't have any other place tonight to put this picture, but it is my all-time favorite John Singer Sargent painting. It's called Lady Agnew of Lucknow. It's from 1892. She looks so cool. She just looks like she is just this incredibly smart, beautiful person who could level you with her eyes. And the way that this is painted is just, it's bravura. It's virtuoso technique. This lavender sash around her waist looks like it was painted with like a single trail of a loaded paintbrush here. Now, as it turns out, she had a flu while he was painting her, and that's why she looks a little bit, weary. But the effect is really stunning nonetheless. All right, so one of the things that we're going to run into as we go through the program tonight is that he painted a lot of beautiful women like this. And if we get too deep into who they are and what their backstory is, it takes us a little too far away from the painting and the artist himself. So what I thought I would do instead is show you as many of these beautiful women in their beautiful dresses as possible in these title slides, and we'll sort of ooh and ah over them, and then we'll see them along the way. But we won't go too deep into like these women and their titles and that sort of thing. So we're going to start off with our introduction to the artist. And I love this quote here: the thicker you paint, the more it flows. And I think you can absolutely see that in a picture like this one. This is Mrs. Henry White from 1882. This is at the National Gallery of Art. And so you can see once again that virtuoso style that we are also fond of when it comes to John Singer Sargent. And of course, his ability to make everybody look so absolutely stunning, so lovely. All right, so let's get started with John Singer Sargent. He was born in 1856 and he dies in 1925. So he's born just after mid-century, and he has a really unusual upbringing. This is him with one of his sisters and him at the age of 18 over here. He was born in Florence, and he had these really nomadic parents. They were expatriates, sort of originally from the Gloucester area, but they chose to just live in Europe and travel around and educate their children by going to some of the world's best museums, by going to churches. His father educated John Singer Sargent in English, French, Italian, and German. He also received watercolor and drawing lessons from his mother. And by the age of 18, he was a really accomplished young man. He was excelling in art, in music, and in literature. So as a teen, his parents started his formal education in art, and ultimately they moved to Paris so that he could go to the École des Beaux-Arts, the premier art school in France at the time. Now, the École des Beaux-Arts is a great place to get this kind of rigorous instruction in drawing and perspective and anatomy. And so while he was attending the École des Beaux-Arts, he also began to study with a sort of up-and-coming portrait painter named named Carolus Duran, and we see him over here in a photograph on the left. Now, Carolus Duran had a really different approach to making art, and he was seen as very modern at the time. But like I said, he was an up-and-coming portrait painter, and John Singer Sargent thought he would kind of balance out this rigorous education he was getting at school with what he could learn from Carolus Duran. Now, here's an example of Carolus Duran's painting on the right. It's a lovely portrait of a woman who clearly looks elegant, sophisticated, rich, of course, right? Because she's wearing this beautiful white dress that is painted again with this kind of bravura style. The way Carolus Duran approached painting, it was called alla prima. It wasn't about drawing something or sketching something out first. It was literally you'd load up your brush with paint and you'd go straight to the canvas. It seems kind of almost obvious to us now that people would approach painting that way, but it was sort of revolutionary for the time. And in addition to just, going straight to the canvas with a brush, I mean, he would load up that brush. He would put as much oil paint on it as possible. So you could really make these like extravagant marks with your brush and make these really beautiful suggestions of fabric and drapery in these portraits. So there's this mastery in terms of the illusion of materials that I think really draws people in, especially with Carolus Duran. And so after studying with him for a few years, John Singer Sargent creates this portrait of his master, Carolus Duran, as sort of like a graduation present, kind of a thank you for the lessons he's learned. And it's also a way to show that he's completely internalized his master's lessons here, because he has focused on creating a beautiful, elegant face, once again, an elegant pose, beautiful hands. But then there's a looseness to the way the rest of this is painted, to the way the jacket is suggested and defined, and even this kind of loose tie or cravat here. The focus here, it brings our eyes, I should say, to his face. And there's some real refinement and subtlety to it. But the way that the clothing is rendered is much looser. Now, Sargent painted this when he was only 23 years old. You can imagine his master was probably pretty proud of him. Sargent wrote a little inscription to his master and referred to himself as his affectionate pupil. From there on in, his career is sort of launched. I should say there's always a critic, though, and sometimes with this, I'll show you a few of the criticisms of some of Sargent's work. Here, one cartoonist clearly thought Carolus Duran looked a little too devilish. But just to sort of wrap up on our introduction to the artist, we have this notion of him launching his career with this work, which I should mention is just down in Massachusetts at the Clark Art Institute. So from there on in, Sargent enjoys a nearly 50-year career. Here he is at age 20, here he is about 30 years later, and we can see during that time he's developed this extraordinary capacity, this extraordinary ability to flatter his subjects, even when it's him, right? I mean, there's this way of kind of softening the features and softening the blemishes, the wrinkles and all of that, and just making somebody look like nobility. So during this 50-year long career that he has, he's working primarily in oil. We'll see towards the end, he really sort of indulges in watercolor. And during this time, he also creates some really impressive mural cycles, and as we'll see, stumbles into his fair share of controversy too. Now, he remained an expatriate like his parents. He was very well traveled, very well educated. He never settles down. He never gets married. He never has children, but he has a very close circle of friends that he stays very connected to. He did have close ties to Boston as well, and we'll see that he paints several large mural cycles in the city of Boston, and he befriended Isabella Stewart Gardner. Here is a photograph of him along with the portrait that's seen in the photograph of him working in Isabella Stewart Gardner's galleries during his lifetime. And here's just sort of an outtake as well. So we think of him as somebody who's really the leading portrait painter of his generation. He's associated with this grand manner style of portrait painting. That is the way that society conveyed conveyed themselves to the world. And it is absolutely impressive and stunning 100+ years later. Now, Sargent himself enjoyed a great deal of fame during his lifetime too. And you can see the more famous he got, the more like the bigger his waistline got in cartoons. So he did have a little bit of an indulgent lifestyle, particularly when it came to smoking and to eating. He died of cardiovascular disease when he was just 69 years old. And so that gives us sort of a sense of like the big picture umbrella arc of his life. So let's turn our attention to sort of how, where he goes really once he's launched his career. All right, so we're turning now to this notion of being a cultural chameleon. This is another stunning woman in a stunning dress. This is Betty Wertheimer, and the picture is in the Smithsonian Institute. It dates to 1908. Don't you just love the way he has suggested that this dress is just a little bit iridescent, and it's painted. I mean, if you really look at those brushstrokes with these big splotchy brushstrokes that that you almost have to kind of stand back or squint to get the full effect of here. Here at this point, I mean, he's sort of past the days where he really wanted to be a portrait painter, but he's still managed to make her look great. And we go back to this notion of the fact that he's loading his brush up to create these really impressive works. So he's launched his career. One of the first things that he does, and actually what he does for the first decade or so of his career, is he's traveling quite a bit and he's absorbing sort of the visuals and a lot of the styles that he samples from around Europe and beyond. This is a work that he created just a year after that portrait of his master, Carolus Duran. And this is also at the Clark Art Institute. It's called The Smoke of Ambergris, and it was inspired by his travels in Northern Africa. And so we've got a sort of exotic subject for the day, at least an exotic subject for his European audiences. And it was something that he had seen. He was sort of inspired by it. He hired a model to kind of recreate this moment. And what she is doing is holding this, this cloth over her head so that she can inhale this particular fragrance coming from this sensor over here. Ambergris has this whole fascinating other history that I won't get into, but it was said to be sort of have like an aphrodisiac effect on those who inhale it. It's a beautiful perfume. So after this work was unveiled at the time when it was first exhibited, an unidentified critic referred to it as a perfect piece of painting. Now, I should emphasize that this was painted at a time when this notion of white on white painting was all the rage in Europe. This is another American expatriate painter who sort of launched this fad of painting white on white. Now, that sounds kind of boring, doesn't it? But now imagine, if you will, somebody handing you a box of white paints or a box of white crayons and saying, make me an interesting picture from this. It's really hard to kind of summon something that that still seems beautiful and can still really resonate with such a limited color palette here. Now, things completely go in the opposite direction in just the space of a few years, because John Singer Sargent, from there, he travels to Spain and he visits prehistoric caves in Spain where prehistoric man had been painting on the wall. And so in addition to his travels and his explorations, he obviously saw some flamenco dancers and some singing performances. And that was the inspiration for this work here, which is called El Jaleo from 1882. Now, if you've been to the Gardner Museum, there's no doubt in my mind you remember this work because it's one of the first ones that you see on the main floor. Actually, Isabella Stewart Gardner redesigned her whole museum to fit around this particular work while she was keeping it safe for a relative. So it's a stunning painting. It's done on a very large scale. Let's kind of move into it. When I used to give tours at the Gardner, I would always say, this is the loudest painting in Boston. And so together with the group, we'd sort of move our eyes through everything that's kind of making sound in this picture, from the clapping to the guitars to the stomping. Maybe she's got some castanets here. And then inevitably somebody would say, well, what about this guy sleeping here? But he's actually the singer, and he is just belting out music from the top of his lungs. There's like this baritone sound to these flamenco singers. And of course, all of this is kind of accentuated by this really dramatic, almost awkward looking pose from this flamenco dancer here, this strong diagonal in the foreground. Now, I mentioned before that John Singer Sargent had visited caves. He had also visited the Prado Museum while he was in Spain, where he saw works by artists like Diego Velázquez, who in summary was doing that same virtuoso white on white thing, but really with black on black. So John Singer Sargent wanted to start injecting black on black into his paintings. We see it here with El Jaleo, but we can also see the influence of those cave paintings on this back wall over here. You can see he's added a bull and even this red handprint, just this little signifier, this little reminder of those prehistoric cave paintings he saw. But all the way on the other side of the painting, he also added text on the back wall. He painted very faintly the words "Ole, Ole" again and again. So in addition to all this music, all this dancing, stomping, castanets, singing, you can imagine all these women over here celebrating their dancing friend by screaming out "Ole, Ole, Ole." It's such a dramatic, dynamic picture. It's one that you don't forget after you see it. It's just stunning. So from Spain, John Singer Sargent makes another big trip, and he heads over to France. And at this point, he's rubbing elbows with all the right people, because while he was in France, he sets up and he meets up with Claude Monet, and he spends at least one day painting with Claude Monet, because this is the result. He's working outside just alongside Claude Monet and his wife, and we even know what painting Claude Monet was working on. This is 1885. And John Singer Sargent's painting is called Claude Monet Painting by the Edge of the Wood. It's from the Tate Modern. And here is the work that Monet was painting over here from the same year. Now, typically, when artists work together alongside each other like this, they typically exchange their works. It's like a little artist gift giving tradition. But I think John Singer Sargent was so proud to be working alongside the Impressionist master at this point that he kept this painting for himself. But we can see that he's almost fully absorbing the Impressionist style at this point. It's like the white on white, the black on black, that's all gone away. He's sitting with Claude Monet, and he's working rapidly outside just the same way he does. And he's using these really quick, broken, visible brushstrokes to describe the landscape here. So we can see that he's just kind of taking on every single style and seeing if it fits. There's a few more works that he created that really, to me, suggest a fondness in particular for Impressionist painting. This is a gorgeous work called Two Women Asleep in a Punt Under the Willows from 1887. I love the way he has described these willow branches here. It transports you to this scene, and we all long to take a nap in this little boat here alongside the reeds here. It's just gorgeous, but you can see the composition, the brushwork is so similar to the same to the work that Monet was doing that same year. This is simply called The Boat from 1887. One more picture in this Impressionist vein. This is a work that's at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and this is Sargent's depiction of a fellow artist named Paul Helu sketching with his wife. And so once again, the grasses are described with those Impressionist brushstrokes, but Sargent is already kind of figuring out, sort of the same way he painted his master, that you can vary your brushwork depending on whether you're painting a face or painting, the loose reeds down by the water. And it's not sort of a jarring effect. Instead, it highlights things like faces and hands. It draws your attention to it. And then you sort of like luxuriate in the rest of the brushwork. Now, this next work that we're looking at here people oftentimes lump it into this section of his career where he's clearly so enamored with the Impressionists. But I think the famous painting called Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose is something totally different. At this point, he's already gone to England, and he's actually hanging around with artists that are really interested in the pre-Raphaelite movement. The importance of realism and the importance of the symbolism of flowers. A great pre-Raphaelite painting, just to jog your memory, if you're sort of familiar with the pre-Raphaelites or want to be, is this depiction of Ophelia from 1852 by Sir John Everett Millais. So there's this whole movement in British art to paint beautiful women, but to really describe the landscape and to only include flowers that have symbolic meaning. So for Sargent, he takes up this subject of carnation, lily, lily, rose, and he very much wants to capture a specific time of day. It's dusk, the sun has just set, there's still like a little bit of lavender light in the air, and these sweet young innocents in their white dresses are just starting to light these Japanese lanterns. And so we've got this magnificent glow from the lanterns, but they're surrounded by the chaos of these flowers here too. So it's a really sort of detailed, stunningly detailed and very specific time of day. Now, the Impressionists, they captured a specific time of day, but they didn't do it with this kind of detail. So what Sargent did was he worked on this painting for months, and he was staying with his friends, and he'd be playing tennis or that sort of thing. And then he'd realize, it's that perfect time of day to keep working on it. And then he'd go and work on it for about 5 minutes and then go back to playing tennis with his friends. So it's much more deliberate. It's much more specific than his sort of dalliances in Impressionism. So we can see that he's kind of moving all over the map, and his artistic style is kind of following him along the way. So now let's turn our attention to John Singer Sargent and his incredible ability to secure portrait commissions with some of the most famous, most notable people in the world at the time. So I call this section Friends in All the Right Places. We've got this stunning portrait here of Mrs. Hugh Hammersley from 1892. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Look, notice how he almost makes it look like he has captured her hand in motion as it's moving across the back of this couch here. But really, the star of the show is once again the dress. You're looking at the dress and you know exactly what material it's made out of, right? It's velvet. How do you paint velvet? How do you paint velvet? He's doing it with these big, bold, sort of gray-white washes here. It doesn't, our eye just makes sense of it. Our brains make sense in terms of what that fabric is here. But there's all sorts of wonderful details to this dress too. The woman herself is not necessarily a stunner. And I think it really connects so well to the quote here, that a portrait is a painting with something wrong with the face. It seems as though he's kind of caught her or captured her in this awkward moment where she's just about to move or she's just about to say something. If she was sort of sitting more solemnly or smiling broadly, she might actually appear more beautiful. But this is a sort of, it's like a momentary glimpse at her in her finest. So let's turn our attention now to, just one last quote here. There's one critic who wrote about this work. He said, "The head literally vibrates with life. Never has the spirit of conversation been more actually and vividly embodied." So he's really captured something. So just to give us a sense in terms of where he is with his career, we've got this great photograph of him. He's probably about 30 years old here. We know he's smart. He's multilingual. He's doing all the work himself from start to finish. You know, the second he secures the commission. He's getting the materials. He is, conversing with the patron, all of it. And so he has this really remarkable personality to go along with it and an incredible work ethic. But we know what it really takes to charm people, and it's confidence. And he had it in spades. He had a great deal of confidence. And that's what led to all the ladies lining up to his Tite Street studio to be Sargented. Everybody wanted to essentially have their glamour shot with John Singer Sargent. Now, just to give you a sense in terms of how well he was doing at this stage in his career, each one of these portraits, he would make the equivalent of about $130,000. And he was painting about 14 of them a year. So he was doing incredibly well for himself. All right, so let's talk about a few of the really preeminent people that he painted. He's painted 2 US presidents. We've got Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson here. There's a great story about the Teddy Roosevelt portrait. John Singer Sargent actually went to the White House, and I think he was staying there with him for quite some time. And the two of them were both very frustrated. Teddy Roosevelt did not want to sit for a portrait. He was very frustrated by having to sit still. And on one day in particular, where they're kind of arguing about, like, how do we proceed if you're not going to pose for me, essentially, Teddy Roosevelt was kind of marching away, and he turned back and he put his hand on the newel post here with his other hand on the hip. And I think he was about to say something sort of snarky or rude, but John Singer Sargent said, "That's exactly the pose. I'm going to paint you just like that." Now he goes from the White House to really the most impressive, the largest privately owned house in the country, and that would be Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina. Now, this was a home that was designed for and owned by the Vanderbilt family. And John Singer Sargent had the sort of preeminent role of painting the architect and the landscape architect for Biltmore. I should mention that Biltmore was finished, I think, in 1895. So both of these portraits date to 1895. Here's our architect, and we can sense that by the fact that he's surrounded by this beautiful architecture. Some of these portraits were kind of panned during his lifetime. One critic I remember said that Sargent did a better job on the fountain here than he did on the architect. But both of these men were sort of, older and in not great health. But Frederick Law Olmsted here, who's like the father of American landscape architecture, who has had such an impact on our country, is seen here as though he's taking a walk through the woods. And he is, of course, the person that designed the 30 plus acres of manicured landscaping at Biltmore. So such a high profile commission here too. Now Sargent goes on to paint a lot of notables in the arts and literature. Here he's gone back and he's painted Claude Monet once again. This is a self-portrait of Claude Monet from 1886. And this is Sargent's portrait of the same man from the following year. I think it's really interesting that he paints him in profile, almost like a president on a coin or something like that. You can tell that he really holds Claude Monet in very high profile. We get a sense of his importance, of his integrity here. But notice now, Sargent is not trying to emulate the Impressionist style. He's found a style that's all his own. It's this grand manner portraiture style that he is best known for. He also painted a portrait of the sculptor Auguste Rodin, who's probably best known for the Thinker statue over here. Auguste Rodin was really the most well-known, the most celebrated sculptor of the 19th century. This was painted in 1884. What a portrait this is. I mean, you really get a sense of his personality. Maybe I always feel like there's a wry sense of humor here. Maybe it's just because of that arched eyebrow. And I love this kind of long flowing reddish beard and the piercing eyes. It's such a fantastic portrait. You feel like you're in the midst of a conversation with him. From there, Sargent has painted a few portraits of leading authors, including Henry James. This was painted in 1913, just after James had been nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. He's the author of Wings of the Dove, Turn of the Screw. And so, of course, Sargent makes him look like such a distinguished sort of thoughtful individual. Now, if we compare this to photographs of Henry James from around the same time, we can see that Sargent certainly flattered his subject. I mean, you could easily mistake this for a different person, but but Henry really admired Sargent. He described him as being civilized to his fingertips, and he was very energetic in terms of promoting Sargent and his work to his circle of friends in London. So I imagine he felt pretty good about the way he was portrayed in the portrait. Sargent also painted, I think, multiple paintings of Robert Louis Stevenson, the author of Treasure Island. So another literary star here. And this is going to sort of take us on a little bit of a tangent, because Sargent did do some experimenting in his paintings. And I would certainly categorize this as an experiment. This is a very strange portrait because it includes Robert Louis Stevenson sort of pacing. He doesn't even look like he's sitting for a portrait. It also includes his wife, who is cut off by the edge of the canvas here, and she's kind of shrouded by a shawl. She doesn't even look like she's aware of this process. And what's at the center of this picture? An open door into a dark back hallway. This is a really unusual composition. Now, and I would add to that too, that Robert Louis Stevenson, well, his proportions look unusual, don't they? He looks very tall and lanky, but if we compare it to a photograph of him, I think Sargent probably hit the nail on the head in this case. So it's a kind of a strange foray in terms of his work. This is still a pretty early work in his entire oeuvre. So I think he's still kind of trying things on. But this is a nice tangent that takes us to, I think, what is a beloved work for many people in New England, because this is just down at the MFA in Boston. And this is, of course, The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd from 1882. Now, this is the very definition of an unusual composition. This was Sargent really experimenting. Now, just a little bit of backstory here. The Boyd family was another American expatriate family that was living in Europe, and they were also artistically inclined. They were friends with John Singer Sargent, and so they invited him. They asked him to paint portraits of their four daughters, or a portrait of their four daughters. Now, we can imagine for paying good money for a portrait, you would want to see every child's face. You would want them looking their absolute best. It's sort of like school picture day, right? This is a really unusual choice in terms of how to portray them, but it has been celebrated since, because even though the girls sort of seem disconnected from each other, some of them are kind of retreating into the shadows over here, it does seem to show kind of the different stages of childhood and how young children sort of engage with adults. So somebody really young, maybe somebody who's about 4 years old, there's a sense of openness. She's sitting there unposed and really open to the presence of this artist in their home. And then you get a little bit older, maybe you're 8 or 9, and you're still curious, but you're kind of reserved. I love how she's standing there with like this toe pointing out towards us, but her hands behind her back. And she's still in the light. She's still in this room. She's still in our space. But we have these two older girls who seem just on the cusp of adolescence. And they are so disinterested, so aloof in this picture, that it probably reminds you of your own experiences with girls this age. And and of course, there's one of them who has completely turned away from the artist and is just leaning against this vase. Now, of course, the vases themselves are also stars in this picture. It's well noted, of course, too, that the MFA has this work exhibited right alongside the actual vases, which apparently it's amazing that they're still in one piece. They've traveled back and forth across the Atlantic like 30 times. And contemporary critics sort of panned this work because, in this cartoon, they sort of make it look as though the vases are really the star of the show too. But I think ever since that initial kind of tepid reception, art historians in particular have really come to love and respect this work, and oftentimes draw parallels between it and this masterpiece by Diego Velázquez called Las Meninas, which dates all the way back to the 1600s. But we have a young princess right at the front center of this painting, and the way she engages with us and with the audience, I think, has these wonderful similarities to it. All right, so we're running short on time. I got to talk even faster now. We're going to dip our toe in a few of Sargent's controversies over the next few years. And he did say, every time I paint a portrait, I lose a friend. So this is a stunning early work by the artist, Madame Ramon Subercaseaux, these gorgeous blues, an incredible dress here. And who wouldn't want to look like this woman? She's lovely and she knows how to play the piano. So our first controversy from John Singer Sargent comes at an early age. He's just 25 years old, and he's painted this portrait of a doctor, Dr. Potsy at Home from 1881. And this is his first large portrait of a male subject. And instead of depicting a doctor as looking like a doctor, looking like a professional, as we can see him in this photograph over here, he's painted him in sort of like loungewear in this, bright red robe, this deep red robe, that to me my brain always sort of immediately thinks of this as like a religious picture, like he's a cardinal or something like that. But the more time you spend with it, the more you see that this is a very sensual picture. And that's what sort of got Sargent in trouble here. Now, Dr. Potsy was a gynecologist, and he was known for his very long, very slender fingers. And that's what Sargent's sort of emphasizing here. But the way that he has these fingers playing with this robe, very sensual. Let me walk you through this. This top hand here is sort of almost holding this robe together. You can almost imagine it, if his hand were to fall away, it could fall open. Now you'll also notice that the robe is tied, almost looks like twice around the waist. And his other hand, those fingers are resting on that rope right there. Once again, suggesting almost like it could be pulled undone at any moment. It's a tantalizing picture. And there was some talk about the placement of those tassels too. So this, I always think of as like the male companion to probably his most famous, well, without a doubt, his most famous controversy, which is Madame X from just a few years later. So I remember that summer of Sargent, 1999 in Boston. These two works were kind of right next to each other. And I my initial thought was they must be a married couple, but they were a pair of controversies, that's for sure. So here we have Madame X, also known as Madame Pierre Gatro. She was 25 years old when this was painted. Sargent was just a few years older at 28. This was 1884 that it was painted, and this is a work that's now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So most of us at this point are probably sort of familiar with the controversy of Madame X. Now, she was also an American expatriate. She was living in Paris. I always think of her as like Paris Hilton, in that she was sort of famous for being famous. She was an unusual beauty, but it was a beauty that people found very alluring. She had this very white skin, and she would kind of powder herself almost lavender. And here she is definitely playing up that skin, or at least Sargent is. So people became almost obsessed with her in Paris society, and artists were literally stalking her like a deer. Everybody wanted the chance to paint her, and she ultimately chooses Sargent. And so Sargent spends almost the better part of a year sketching her, coming up with composition ideas. And he struggled with this due to what he described as the unpaintable beauty and hopeless laziness of Madame Gatro. So we see a lot of pictures of her just kind of lounging around here. And then ultimately he comes up with this idea of this black dress with this really tight bodice here this kind of sweetheart neckline as well. And so we can see sort of the evolution from the watercolor here to the sketch over here, highlighting this like this stunning profile, this really distinctive nose that she has. And then we get closer to that finished work with her arms sort of stretched backwards. It kind of reminds me of the flamenco dancer that we had seen earlier. Now, of course, the big controversy here is that strap for the dress. You probably heard that the way it was originally painted, the strap was coming off the shoulder and people couldn't handle it. This caused such an uproar. It was like the way people thought of it is like, she's already beautiful. She's already sensual. This is just over the top. It's like American crudeness and it's just absolutely unnecessary. So Sargent actually had to go back and repaint the strap so that it was upright because I mean, you're already showing a lot of flesh. You already get this tiny little waist. Do you really have to go that much further? Now, I have a sort of dated comparison here. There was some award show, this is probably 10 years ago now, but Angelina Jolie showed up in a beautiful black dress and it became this joke because for every photograph she took, she popped her leg out of this very high slit. And so everybody was joking about this leg pop, which seemed so unnecessary. We already know she's beautiful. We already know she's sensual. She doesn't have to show off a naked leg at this award show in order to convey that. So it was the same sort of thinking around Madame X. And of course, there were always critics, in this case, the critics that sort of pan her appearance and the stylized bodice here as well. I mean, everybody's a critic. Now, John Singer Sargent was pretty fond of this work, as it turns out. Here he is in his studio in 1885. He kept this painting for 36 years. And in 1916, he sold it to the Met. And he wrote to the director, "I suppose it's the best thing I've ever done." Says a lot. Now, Madame Gatro had her portrait painted many times throughout her life. If you compare it to works by other artists, I think I'd go with the Sargent too. This brings us to Isabella Stewart Gardner of Boston, who never shied away from a controversy herself. Just 4 years later, she had her portrait painted by John Singer Sargent. She hated to have her photograph taken. I think she liked the control that she could have with the portrait. She's closing in on 50 years old here, and she gets this sort of, photoshopped effect of her face here. Now, the controversy when it came to Isabella Stewart Gardner and this stunning full-length portrait, which in many ways is reminiscent of Madame X with that tiny little waist and the sweetheart neckline again. Well, there's a number of things. This was considered really an ostentatious display of wealth. She's got pearls at her neck, at her waist, and rubies too. Rubies here, 2 here, and then 2 on her shoes. In addition to that, she's showing off a lot of skin. In this case, she's got these kind of empty arms here, which are kind of sad, knowing that she lost a child and was never able to have any more children. But she also is standing in front of a fragment of a tapestry that's in the Gardner's collection. And the way she's standing, it sort of looks like she's got a halo here, maybe even like a little crown on top of her head. And so contemporary critics thought, like, they literally said, who does she think she is? Some sort of Byzantine Madonna? And so that's exactly how she installed her work. She put it in a room that is filled with religious art and other Byzantine Madonnas. And she set it up with a chest in front of her painting and a giant prayer book in front of it. So if nothing else, she had a sense of humor about it. All right, so we'll kind of, knowing that we're short on time, we'll turn our attentions now to some of his major works and those lofty ambitions that he had. Saying, "I am in hot water." He could get into trouble even when he wasn't painting portraits, but he was getting kind of sick of it too. Here's another gorgeous portrait of, in this case, Mrs. George Swinton. This is from 1897. It's in the Wirt Walker collection. Just the sleeve here. I'd take the painting just for the sleeve. Excuse me, just one moment. That gorgeous iridescent material. It's like the height of femininity right here. All right, so this brings Sargent to Boston, and here we're looking at the McKim building of the Boston Public Library, right in Copley Square. Which, if you've been in, if you've never been inside, you absolutely must go. There's so much incredible public art throughout this building, and at the very top level, there is a series of murals that were done by John Singer Sargent. Now, this is free and open to the public. You can just wander up there yourself. The subject of the murals is the triumph of religion, sort of an odd topic for a library. But I think John Singer Sargent was imagining the space as his very own Sistine Chapel. And so we won't be able to get too deep into all of the symbolism here. We're just really going to touch on the controversy for the most part. But he had lofty aspirations when it came to this. Now, with some of these works, he was painting them in London. This is these spandrels set up in his studio in London, and then he would travel across the ocean with them. So let's kind of zoom in on some of the imagery here. The triumph of religion is about the entire history of religion. We have, Egyptian pharaohs and Assyrians, and all of like the related visual iconography from these different eras kind of coming together. In addition to painting, there's all this gold relief work too. Text integrated here, and there's so many layers to this. So this is like a half moon shape panel that is part of the picture, but just above it, framing the ceiling here, if we zoom out, I just wanted to show you this spandrel that goes up on the ceiling and curves all the way across, because it's some of the most interesting and complicated imagery I've ever seen. We're going to just sort of breeze through it very quickly. But just to give you a sense in terms of how he's integrating the iconography from different cultures, from different religions, from different time periods, it's really just astonishing. But this panel that kind of wraps around the ceiling, I think it's kind of anchored by this figure here. You can see the eyes. This is sort of, you can almost think of this round piece here as almost like a disc that goes around this figure's neck. They've got this bird-like headpiece, and then you can see the body extending down here as well. Now, of course, there's all these different layers of things in front of it, but I want to sort of invert the image just for a moment. Here's the bottom of the picture we were just looking at. Here's that face with those eyes, and you can see at the top, going in a completely opposite direction, is a whole other deity here with this diaphanous blue gown. She's absolutely gorgeous, and she's seamlessly integrated. It's really stunning. So when you're standing there on the floor, it's like you're looking back, you're looking forth, and it's really just absolutely mesmerizing. Now, I bring all of this up just to bring you to the controversy of this particular cycle of murals. There's so much more going on here, but this is a series that was unfinished. This is sort of the major central work that it was never painted, and it's because the two works on either side caused such a controversy. The work over here on the right is called the church. And so we have sort of like a pietà scene here with Mary and the dead Christ at her feet. And she looks triumphant. She looks powerful, sort of larger than her adult son down below. But this was coupled with an image that was called synagogue. And we can see here that it's the image of a blinded figure here whose crown is falling off, whose scepter is broken, and whose tent is caving in on them. So it certainly seems as though he's saying something negative about Judaism in comparison to Christianity. He defended this by saying he's like appropriating some of the imagery from the Sistine Chapel here. He did not intend for this to be read as anti-Semitic. Nevertheless, people were incensed when they saw this, and people threw ink at it, and essentially the whole project stopped in 1924. So he just decided he wouldn't go forward with this, but he did have other major mural cycles, and he had major commissions like this one here called Gast from 1919. This is a painting that's about 20 feet long. I apologize. Just to give us a sense of scale here with the people trying to move it. And it's a painting that was created in response to World War II. It's at the Royal Academy of Arts in, or I'm sorry, it's at the Imperial War Museum in London. But it was voted Picture of the Year by the Royal Academy of Arts in 1919. And of course, it's in response to chemical warfare being used during World War I, the use of mustard gas, which blinded soldiers. So we have this history of war painting where typically it's like you're describing the heroes or the martyrs or the villains of a particular conflict. And what Sargent does with this massive work is really to describe the human impact of war and chemical warfare in particular. So we have this sea of bodies in the foreground. These are all wounded young soldiers who have all been blinded. And then this column of soldiers that are trying to work their way over to a medical tent that is outside the frame of the picture. We see another column of wounded soldiers also heading in that direction. So it's literally the blind leading the blind. There's something about this step here that just always reminds me of how disorienting it is to walk and not be able to see anything. It's like you don't know where you're stepping, you hardly know how to move. And so this is a picture that forces you to think about what is the rest of their lives going to look like after this. So some controversy, some works that were highly celebrated. So now let's turn our attention to sort of the end of his career and his watercolors. We still have got a lovely lady in a beautiful dress to take us there. So this is the Millicent, Duchess of Sutherland from 1903. What a stunning dress here. It almost looks like it can fall right off of her, but there's a lot more color and pattern here than we've seen before. Now at this point, Sargent says, I hate to paint portraits. I hope to never paint another portrait in my life. Clearly, he's gotten sick of entertaining these people and talking to them while he's painting them. So he kind of runs off with his friends. He had gotten really adept at painting with small easels and kind of traveling around because he did some work as a military artist in 1918. Here's an image of him painting while he was a military artist. And here's just a photograph of him making a watercolor. But what he does is really after 1900, he begins to travel. He's got this great circle of friends that he travels with, and his watercolors capture these different parts of the world so beautifully. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever tried your hand at watercolors before, but whenever I try, it is just a watery mess. Basically, everything just bleeds together. I have no control. And when I look at these images, all I see is the control and this wonderful play of color. I mean, to be able to like drag these kind of lavender tree trunks here through the darkness of the paint that's in the background and to sort of keep them separate from each other is just remarkable. So over here on the left, we've got Florida. Over here on the right, we've got a vision of Maine. These are from the late teens, early 1920s. I mean, even this skirt here with the cross hatching, again, just remarkable control. So he's traveling all over the world. These are paintings from the Alps. He's got these friends of his that are just like sitting in these piles of petticoats, apparently just watching him paint and hang around with him. But oftentimes he's painting his friends, reading or, talking to each other in the sun. It looks like a very nice life for these ladies. And these are highly prized works of his because he really was as much of a virtuoso with this medium as he was with oil painting. One of my favorite Sargent watercolors is just, I feel like they're all my favorites, but this one is so simple, but the colors are so beautiful. This is Corfu, Greece. It's 1909. And it's, it's the side of a small, simple, white, presumably white building. But we see all these beautiful kind of lavender colors from the trees around it. And then these fuchsias that are sort of coming up from the bottom. It's just his sense of color is just so beautiful and so remarkable here. And that he could create this picture that's really all about the dance of these shadows on this building. And it just, I mean, it literally just, it ignites something in me when I look at it. I think of it as being so masterful. Even just the blues on the roof, it's gorgeous. But probably his most celebrated series are his works in Venice. Who wouldn't want to paint some watercolors on a gondola in Venice? He did a lot of this. And for these, you can see that he did some preparatory drawings for them to really nail the architecture. But I always go to how he's painted the water, because his sense of creating the movement of that water, the reflections in that water, sometimes it's really loose, and sometimes it's really sort of methodical the way he's laying in color. But these are all just, I mean, masterpieces in their own right. Now, this last work, this last watercolor that I wanted to share with you is called White Ships. I don't think that this is necessarily Venice. This dates to 1908. It's in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum. It's another knock your socks off painting. I love the way he has created all of the white dancing reflections, the light coming off of the water here, reflecting onto the sides of the boats. If I tried to paint water and just made a bunch of like brown smears down there, it would, I can guarantee you, it would look really bad. But so he's found a way to just make it sing. He's found a way to paint all of this rigging with just enough kind of moisture and pigment on the brush to describe this with this kind of virtuoso looseness. Even the way this brush stroke right here is so kind of loose, you can see right through it, but at the same time, your eye really reads it as being a rope. It's incredible. It's really amazing to me that anybody can do this. So we're running late on time. We're going to wrap up right now with his legacy. What a painting this is right here. This is Lady Helen Vincent in Venice from 1904. This is at the Birmingham Museum of Art. I mean, he's really loading it on with the dress and the pearls here, right? But she looks ever so elegant. Now, this quote here is sort of what gets us into trouble later on with his career and his legacy, where he says, "I don't dig beneath the surface for things that don't appear before my eyes." Because shortly after his death, actually towards the end of his career, Sargent gets really hit for being pretty superficial, for his works being superficial. Now, I'm so happy to say that in New Hampshire, we have his last oil portrait at the Currier Museum. This is Grace Alvina, Marchioness Curzon of Kettleston from 1925. And I mean, she looks like she just stepped out of Downton Abbey, right? I mean, look at all the pearls, look at all of this kind of diaphanous material around her waist. I always sit up a little bit straighter when I see her too. She's so impressive. But just to give you a sense in terms of how out of step this sort of painting was with what else was happening in the world, you have artists like Picasso and Edward Hopper and Kandinsky, who are painting, abstraction or total non-objective art or modernism, painting realism, but in a modernist way. So Sargent's work just seemed very dated at the time and really too focused on things like wealth and beauty, when artists of the 20th century were looking to explore the world in a very different way. So this is kind of a long quote. I won't sit here and just read it to you, but I do want to just emphasize this phrase here: the essential emptiness of Sargent's mind. This is a quote from the 1930s by a critic named Lewis Mumford. So we get this sense that as time progresses away from his death, the critics are just really they're not impressed with what he was doing. Actually, at mid-century, art critics like Clement Greenberg called for, well, they were calling for art to be more flat. They were calling for works like abstract expressionism and Jackson Pollock. And so, so Sargent's paintings, believe it or not, were selling at auction for less than $300. Like nobody cared about what he was doing. But then we have Norman Rockwell. We've got a cultural revolution happening in the 1960s, and he gives us sort of a peek back in terms of what Sargent meant for us, at least for a time. And with this work here for Look magazine called Picasso versus Sargent, we can sort of see that the new age lady of the day would be more interested in modernism and maybe like kind of looking towards the future. And maybe the people of an older generation might have kind of dated notions about what is feminine and what is beautiful. I think what Rockwell is saying is that these two things can exist simultaneously. So we have Rockwell, now we go to Warhol, and Warhol, he makes everything cool and so he started to kind of reassess Sargent and help the country reassess him. He said, Sargent made everybody look glamorous, taller, thinner, but they all have a mood and every one of them has a different mood. That's why they're so appealing, right? So in more recent years, his auction prices have been going through the roof. Here's a slightly different version of that Robert Louis Stevenson that we saw. It sold for almost 10 million in 2004. And the same year, this group called Group with Parasols from 1905 sold for almost 24 million. And that was actually double the estimate from Sotheby's. So the incredible thing about Sargent is that his work can still draw the crowds too. I mentioned the Summer of Sargent. That was a show that toured the National Gallery of Art, the Tate, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And I believe nearly 1 million visitors went to go see it. Its final weekend in Boston, the museum was open 24 hours a day to accommodate the demand for this work. So why do we love it? One very cynical perspective from critics recently is that it's something about the Gilded Age. It's something about looking at people of a different class, of a higher class. And so I bring in this image of Ivanka Trump here, sort of similar to what we see in the Sargent over here on the left. This one critic wrote, "The appeal, nay, the point of Sargent is beauty, extravagance, and the visual representation of social hierarchy." And to a certain extent, we as Americans love that, right? I mean, that's why a lot of people watch reality TV. That's why there's this continued appeal for so many to have like a billionaire a president, right? There's something about this social hierarchy and wealth that we gravitate towards. But we'll end with this image, this gorgeous image of a Capri girl on a rooftop from 1878. I would argue that the reason we love Sargent is that it is fantasy, it's escapism, the fact that he created a world that is about beauty and it's devoid of work or conflict. We can dive into these pictures and pretend for a while. And that's what makes them so wonderful. He taps into a system of representing a world that we all want to be a part of. So I will end there for now. And I welcome any questions or comments you might have about John Singer Sargent. Feel free to use the chat, or I think we're an intimate group tonight. So if you wanted to take yourself off mute, feel free to do that too.
Jane, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions for Jane? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I wanted to thank you too. That was amazing. I really, really enjoyed that. And I had no idea about those watercolors. Those are exquisite.
Oh, aren't they just amazing?
Thank
Don't you just want to
so
wallpaper
much.
your house with them?
Listening
really
to you was a delight. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
I noticed that sometimes he did watercolor sketches before the paintings themselves. Do you think that was maybe his first love is watercolors?
I wonder about that. That's a great thing to notice, Robin. That is very interesting. I wonder if there's something about like the immediacy of it.
Mm.
I don't know, but that's a wonderful, wonderful observation. And I
Oh,
think you're probably right.
oh, it's so impressive.
Yeah.
And everybody's just so thankful. And I love his use of the light on not only the
Oh,
the
right.
like the velvet dresses and the sleeves, but also on the little pearls and the flowers. And you're right, I would love to take a nap under those willow trees anytime in the boat.
We all want to live in a Sargent painting.
Yes.
I always feel like I should get dressed up for this presentation. Don't I have any ball gowns? Why don't I have ball gowns?
Pearls, yes. Oh, would anybody else have anything that they'd like to talk to Jane about, or any other observations or questions? It was just a fantastic program. I love it.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go.
Oh,
Yes.
thanks, Sharon. Yeah, now you can imagine him like just taking a break from tennis and just be like, okay, I'm just gonna get a little bit of light here. But yeah, I think, I think it has some really interesting relationships to like pre-Raphaelite art and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So if you enjoyed tonight's program, you can visit my website too. I am culturallycurious.com. I do programs like this usually 5 times a week on a variety of different subjects. So I think I have earth art coming up in the next few days and Van Gogh on Sunday. So that should be really fun. And those are all free. I work with a number of New England libraries to host these. So you can find registration links on my website as well.
Wonderful. Well, you can tell that you really are passionate about this. It was a
Love
wonderful
this.
presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin. It was so nice to work with you. Thanks, everybody. Take
Thank
good care.
you. Thanks.